background issues, not just the headlines, but what's causing various things, defense budgets, defense industry, mergers, acquisitions, and general strategic trends. Initially with overwhelmingly a UK focus, but more and more with European, and then I'll admit, cherry picking some of the global issues just to see especially how they then affect the UK and Europe.
Thank you. Elizabeth.
Yes, as was mentioned, I'm a visiting fellow at American Enterprise Institute, where I focus on new national security threats. And as we all know, those the national security threats that are increasing the most are the ones that are directed against civil society, and that includes hostile business practices, which is part of what this is about. How do we, as liberal democracies, keep our economies safe from predatory business practices? I was previously with Rusi in London, and in the previous life, when I was a journalist, I, among other things, spent 5 years reporting about technology based in I was based in San Francisco, reporting about technology.
Thank you. And finally, Michael.
Yes, thank you. As you said, I'm managing partner of Renaissance Strategic Advisors. We are a consultancy specializing exclusively in aerospace and defense. FDI strategies are a central focus as we work with companies all over the world looking to enter foreign markets, including the United Kingdom. We also do a lot of work in M&A with banks, with private equity, much of which is cross-border.
Thank you very much indeed. Now I've saved the first question from Stuart Anderson.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, everyone. It would be great if you could set out by explaining to us what you see as the risks of hostile foreign involvement in the defence supply chain. And Elizabeth, could you start us off, please?
Yes, so the way we are set up as liberal democracies is that innovation happens in the private sector, and it happens at different levels, starting in the case of the defense industry, starting with the primes and trickling all the way down to startups. And so what's happening now, and where it affects the defense industry, is that China has two strategies underway, and mostly this is a problem that concerns China, even though we should just say that China is the only perpetrator of any sort of aggressive acts. But China has two strategies underway that I think we should be concerned about. One is Made in China 2025, which is China's strategy for economic superpower status, and the other one is called military civil fusion, where it seeks to incorporate civilian innovation into the defense supply chain to improve its own defense industrial capabilities, and by extension its own armed forces. And of course it wants to be able to better sell better military equipment to other countries to essentially improve its own defense industry. And the problem there is that innovation in China is not as good as innovation here, or it's not as wide-ranging as it is here. And so where it concerns us is when Chinese companies start investing in our companies to get access to our innovations, be they civil or military, for civil or military use, and for China's benefit and to our deterrent.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Francis, would you like to add anything to that?
Following on from the policy of civil-military fusion, it is impossible to say that this is a Chinese commercial aerospace company, this is Chinese military aerospace defense company. The two are inextricably linked. And one of the key mergers and acquisitions entities in China is AVIC, which is their defense aviation company. So anyone saying, oh, well, we felt happy that this company could buy a British commercial company because it's not defense. It is utter rubbish. You cannot make that distinction. Everything China is doing, they believe that if they get commercial aerospace technology, that will end up in the defense sphere. The two are linked.
Thank you. You mentioned mergers and acquisitions. Would you like to come in on that, Michael, and just share your views, please?
Sure. Hostile foreign involvement is a risk to our sovereignty, freedom of action, our competitive advantage, and obviously critical IP, but it's also a threat to our ability to collaborate. And the UK needs to consider collaborative alliances with foreign partners, especially on marquee projects for which we have insufficient local demand. And Tempest is an obvious example. We need our partners to trust our supply chain. It's also a threat to core security partnerships, like in maintaining Five Eyes status. To be a serious partner, we need to ensure that our house is in order. This is the case with the Huawei situation regarding our ability to maintain Tier 1's intelligence sharing status with Five Eyes. It also helps us when it comes to attracting inward foreign direct investment. Again, we need to ensure that our house is in order, and we need our potential foreign inward investors to trust the integrity of our supply chain.
Thank you. Chair?
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Francis, did you want to come back in on?
I think Elizabeth was first with her hand up, so if she wants to.
Sorry, I missed that. Elizabeth?
Thank you, Francis. Yes, I just wanted to add, this is not just a problem for the UK, but for every liberal democracy. We're seeing exactly the same scenario in every developed country. And every developed country is at a loss about what to do, because we do need foreign investments. That's what makes our economy tick, but that money is supposed to benefit us and individual companies, not a country that is engaging in a strategic competition with us. And if I can just read something that was said at the previous inquiry, which I think really demonstrates what's happening. It was the inquiry that was held by the BICE committee, and in fact the Defence Select Committee 2 years ago, and Alex Chisholm, who was Permanent Secretary of the BICE Department, I think it was Dr. Hughes asked him how many times the UK government had intervened in mergers and acquisitions on national security grounds under the Enterprise Act from 2002. And Mr. Chisholm said it had only happened 8 times. And then Richard Harrington, who was the Undersecretary, Richard Harrington MP, came in and said, and here's the quote, "There have been 8 interventions, but that has to be put into the context of literally thousands of M&A transactions. I don't think anyone could say that foreign investment in this country is anything other than welcome, and that will remain the case." And I think it demonstrates the dilemma that we as liberal democracies are in. We need the money, and but we need to limit the damage it can cause.
Thank you. Francis, you wanted to come in on that point as well?
Just following up on both Elizabeth's and Michael's points, you said supply chain, and perhaps this is the issue. The Chinese, and for them, the Russians, the Soviets, are not stupid enough to try and put in a bid to buy BAE Systems or Rolls-Royce. They know that every single alarm would go off. If you are going to get an advantage, strategic advantage, industrially, technologically, you go not just one tier down, probably 2 or 3 tiers down. And it's precisely the area every government department, Ministry of Defence, BAEs, whatever, goes, well, we haven't got the resources to check any of this. And that's precisely why it is such an easy way to get in. And yes, we've seen a report by the Henry Jackson Society. I think they said 110 companies bought by Chinese entities. I suspect if you did a broader survey, if you had the resources, you would find it would be many hundreds, and the ripples out from that into defence, commercial aerospace, and back again would probably shock people.
Well, I think before we come in on that point, I think it would need very nicely to my colleague Tobias to come in. Chair, over to you.
Yes, Tobias, over to you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Let's look back at the last 10 years. We're all very awake to what China is up to today, but looking back at it, at what moment should we have had that wake-up point? Or do you think we're still drifting? Can I ask Elizabeth first?
I think maybe the wake-up call should have been when China launched its the Made in China 2025 plan, but it seemed so innocuous at the time. I mean, which large country wouldn't want to be an economic superpower? I don't think we realized that it would involve us losing assets for China to be able to handle that. But I think certainly in the last couple of years has been so obvious that Chinese companies are buying up, as Francis said, not just major companies, because all sorts of alarm bells would go off, but smaller ones that are not household names, that won't get coverage in the media and are not multi-billion pound deals. So certainly for me in 2018, it was clear that it was a question of China trying to undermine our ability to innovate. But for legislators, when it is a very blunt tool to legislate and to impose restrictions. So I mean, it's easy to, in hindsight, blame legislators for not having done enough.
Thank you. Could I ask, going to Michael next, I mean, we've just had this integrated review, the first step of this, a confirmation by the government that they're willing to invest additional funding on our defense posture. We still await to hear where that money will go, what Britain stands for, what does it mean to be part of global Britain. We won't see that until February. Would you like to see a Sputnik moment when we actually label China for what it is, for the geopolitical threat that it's turning out to be, not least because of its direction of travel and what it is doing with its investment in Western companies?
I think that we need to have a moment when we realize that the only way that we can more effectively engineer and monitor and evaluate any takeover attempt, Chinese or otherwise, into this country is when we've developed a very effective defense and security capability development plan, from which should flow a very clear industrial strategy that highlights key technologies and key capability areas that we want to keep sovereign, and from which we can birth an effective and comprehensive regulatory regime. I think that doing so would enable us to not only create the infrastructure necessary for all companies to go through when they're trying to access our markets, but it will also, if done correctly, not just provide those frameworks, but empower specific departments within government, for example, to actually be very dynamic when it comes to evaluating potential deals, but also deals that have happened. Francis talked about issues around the supply chain as we go down the tiers, and that's very true. We need only look at the United States for examples of where Chinese concerns have come in to snatch up organizations, very small companies, for just a few $1 million. Now, in these cases, the company runs out of cash. The Chinese concern can come in and basically pay for it, obviating the need for specialized M&A advisory and legal counsel. But the United States actually has the mechanisms by which to go out and actively monitor this activity and unwind it when necessary. So I think that the answer to that question really relies on the formation of a very well thought out and comprehensive framework from which a regulatory regime can be produced.
Thank you for that. Francis, what's your thoughts on this?
To take your last question first, are we drifting? Yes, because if the drift had stopped, there would be legislation in place, such as Michael has referred to. And until there is legislation, until there is the process to oversee takeovers, drift will continue. In terms of the wake-up point, as regards defence industry specifically in Britain, I would go back to a piece by Deborah Haynes of Sky News in June last year, where she highlighted the fact that a company, Exception PCB, a printed circuit board maker in Tewkesbury, the archetypal boring subsystem supplier, was actually owned by a Chinese defence aerospace company. And they provide circuit boards for the engine control unit for the F-35. They provide circuit boards for Typhoon fighter, for the Meteor beyond visual range air-to-air missile. It's so far below the horizon. Of course, the MOD had no idea this had happened, and the purchase was in 2013. Speaking subsequently to well-qualified electrical engineers, they said, yeah, printed circuit boards, really boring. But the company has to know what G-forces that circuit board is due to take, has to know the voltages, the power, the temperature range, and that, quite frankly, if you gave an electrical engineer all of that data, they will be able to start to reverse engineer the capabilities of the overall system. And again, it's this thing of Chinese not buying Rolls-Royce, but they buy people who supply Rolls-Royce with their critical systems, and they start to reverse engineer those, the engines, or if it's BA systems, the fighters, or the missiles of MBDA.
But I think the MOD did come back to say that there was, they looked into this, and they said that there was no ability for the Chinese to influence, or there was no danger to the F-35.
They had no idea. They had no idea what was going on. And indeed, talking to Deborah afterwards, there was an MOD team down at the company the day after the report trying to find out what was going on. The MOD traditionally goes, it's supply chain. It's nothing to do with us. So I'm afraid I do not believe the MOD's assurances on that. There are so many other examples. Henry Jackson Society points out other companies. The MOD does not monitor this. And just to take one point about Michael saying, Michael talking about different departments looking after this. Perhaps this is the problem in Britain. We shouldn't have different departments monitoring this. There needs to be a single point of focus, and it shouldn't be about that department's own interest. It needs to be about national security.
So on that, the printed circuit board company, do you believe that there's still questions to be answered by the MOD?
I would hope that any potential issues about technology leakage have been sorted out. But the fact is, for 6 years, it had been owned by a Chinese entity. Seriously, you go to the Shenzhen Air Show and whatever, there is no, and as Elizabeth has said about the combination of commercial and defense in one, the idea that there is a benign Chinese industrial interest in a company like that, which doesn't leak into the military, means for 6 years, who knows what has flowed across the internet back to China.
Okay, but just on that one, this is the parent company, Shenzhen. So the Gloucester-based company that prints the circuit boards would claim that there is a firewall in between the two. You're saying that it's still, you could penetrate that?
No. What I'm saying is, what has happened in the 6 years until the report came out? At a time, the MOD wasn't monitoring it. They had not paid any attention to it. How do we know? And it's just an example, bearing in mind all the evidence is that you cannot separate commercial, civilian, defense technology, and that actually China actively says, get commercial technology in and we can migrate.
It's about relative to what we had previously, if you like, for the fourth quarter, relative to what we are now assuming, it's a 3 or 4 percentage point shortfall in GDP. I mean, a chunk of that was already, if you like, in the bag, even prior to the announcement of the national lockdown, the result of both those voluntary social distancing activities that people had clearly taken, and the tiered restrictions. It's a combination of voluntary action, the tiered restrictions, and the national lockdown that gives you that all-in roughly 4 percentage point drop in GDP.
Yeah, and if you were to try and isolate just the impact of the lockdown of that 3 to 4%, would you be able to have a guesstimate of what that might be?
I mean, it's quite hard to prize apart those 3 effects that I mentioned. Because of course, even before the announcement of the national lockdown, there was some anticipation of the effects of the national lockdown. So, rough orders of magnitude, I would say of that, say, 4 percentage point delta change in GDP, perhaps a third, perhaps as much as a half, was the incremental effects of the national lockdown. But I'd put some big uncertainty bounds around that for the reasons I say. Differentiating these different effects is at the moment extremely difficult, I think.
Okay, so maybe 1.5% to 2%, but with a big margin of uncertainty around. Andrew, you're trying to come in, please do.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on that point because there's 2 ways of obviously assessing the answer to your question, which is one is what's the change in our forecast caused by the particular piece of components of it, of which the lockdown, as you rightly say, would be one. But can I just I just want to strike a note of care here. That's not the answer to the question, what's the impact of the lockdown in terms of a cost-benefit type of question. Because, of course, to do that, we would have to specify an alternative, if you like, baseline counterfactual path.
Yeah.
And we would have to do something that we don't do, which is forecast the path of COVID. So I know that there's a lot of, obviously, and the committee is obviously rightly focused on this question, but I think it's just important to draw that distinction between these two ways of answering your question.
Yes, absolutely. I was very aware of just doing one side of an equation here. And I was going to come on to that point, although I accept that it's not your area to look at. But well, let me just chance my arm and ask the question. Do you have any, you must speak to epidemiologists, you must sort of conjure with what the impacts of, if the government doesn't make these changes, which in the event it did, you must have had some sense of what you thought might have happened under those circumstances.
Well, I mean,
what do you think the other side of the equation looks like, the counterfactual?
Well, first of all, yes, I mean, just take two parts of that. First of all, yes, we do speak to we're not medical experts, as you'll be very well aware, and we are very well aware, so we do talk to people. I talked to Chris Whitty, and who has been extremely helpful, actually, in terms of giving his views, certainly. So we do that. I think on the broader question, and I'm sure my colleagues want to come in on this question, we are cautious here because it's not just government policy that obviously determines, that would determine the course of this. An important point which Andy referred to is that there is what I might call the natural caution of people. So in thinking about a counterfactual which would have, say, a different policy prescription in it, you'd also have to factor in how individuals would behave in that scenario, because what we observe, and we've seen this with a number of the announcements, is that people actually do start to anticipate, if COVID is increasing in its incidence, which it has been, actually people's natural cautions tends to lead them to behave somewhat differently. So you do have to factor that in. Plus, obviously, there's the very big question then, which we're not experts in, is what is the impact of the particular measures on the incidence of COVID going forwards? Now, there are some emerging approaches and models in economics, and I mean, Silvana may want to come in at this point, which try to deal with that, but that's not what we do in our forecasts, because we condition our forecasts on announced and stated government policies.
Okay, well, perhaps I can, thank you, Andrew, bring Silvana into this fight. I mean, it's very impossible question to answer, I know, but I'll ask it anyway, and you perhaps do your best with it. Do you think, on balance, if you took, say, a view casting out some months, that in the absence of having taken the lockdown, if nothing had been done, do you have a sense of economically what that might have meant? And if you do, what does that tell you? Or what is that sense of economically what would happen? Sorry, that was to Silvana. If
oh, sorry, I thought you were still on the governor. So again, as Andy and the governor suggested, this is an extremely difficult question. There are multiple two-way causal interactions here, and they can also change over time. The spread of the virus affects economic activity because people reduce their spending on social goods and services, and they do not carry certain activities in order to reduce the health risk. So in other words, there's social distancing, some social distancing, whether there is lockdown or not. In the other direction, economic activity itself, particularly in certain sectors, affect the spread of the virus. In turn, lockdown measures are responding to the spread of the virus, and the spread of the virus depends on the lockdown measures in place. Yet another complication here that I want to highlight is that there's scope for substitution and learning, substitution towards safer activities and learning of new technologies to carry on work and consumption. And because that learning improves over time, it's very likely that early lockdowns have a much bigger impact on activity than subsequent ones. Another issue that is very likely is that the second national lockdown was imposed at a time in which activity was materially reduced. So the incremental impact of that second lockdown on economic activity will probably be much, much lower than otherwise. So to assess the effect of lockdowns on economic activity, researchers are now using what they call the epi-macro models, which combine economics and epidemiology. I gave a speech earlier this summer discussing the huge amount of new research on this issue. These models take into account the behavior of people, their voluntary social distancing, and the interactions with the economy. And that allows them to exactly or more closely pinpoint the extra effect of a lockdown measure on the economy, which you really want in order to do a proper cost-benefit analysis. In our forecast at the Bank of England, we're just trying to forecast, to predict what will happen given the mix of virus, restrictions, and people's behavior. We are not trying to compare what might happen with a different set of restrictions. Changing those restrictions would imply changing also all our assumptions on the virus and on people's behavior. Otherwise, the forecast would not be internally consistent. So to do what you want, you really need a model designed to track how economic behavior is affected by the lockdown measures and taking into account all these interactions. And there is a lot of progress done on that. As I said, the UK has one of the leading researchers on the area, Ben Moll at the London School of Economics. I think it's early days still, even them are struggling. They have very good qualitative descriptions of the different effects, but quantitatively, those models still have quite a bit of uncertainty. And I think it's extremely difficult given, again, all the interactions and the change in behavior over time.
That's a very helpful explanation. It would be helpful, actually, if the modelling and the work that you referred to, you might be able to send something to the committee on that. I think we'd be interested in.
Oh, yeah, definitely. We can certainly do that, yes.
Very, very interested in looking at it. I'm way over time, but I just have to ask one very brief question to Andy Haldane, if I may. You mentioned, Andy, factoring into the forecasting treatments, etc. Is the general course of progress towards vaccines that are going to be distributed and hopefully work broadly in line with the expectations that you factored into the model? Or are you more bouncy now that AstraZeneca's come forward and etc.?
Well, bouncy might be pushing it, Chair, but I think our forecasting assumptions had been for a gradual phasing in of improved treatments from around the middle of next year. I would say, personally speaking, that relative to that assumption, the news we've had is to the positive side on that. We've seen that already in some movements in financial markets and some measures of confidence and expectations, that there is some evidence of that, of the vaccine news having already provided a bit of a improvement to at least confidence and expectations, and hopefully in time activity. So I'd say we need to work this through in the context of the February forecast, but I'd say on balance, that news has been to the positive side of our assumptions in November.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful. Angela, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And staying with the vaccine, I noticed that your report was finalised and agreed literally days before the news on Pfizer and Moderna, and now today's good news on the Oxford vaccine as well. To what extent, Governor, do you think that this is transformational, or are you still quite cautious?
Well, I think it's excellent news. I mean, I must say, you know, only speaking personally for a moment, it felt like the first time sort of in, I don't know, 8 or 9 months now, that there was some light sort of coming at the end of the tunnel. So I have to say, I think it's terrific news, and I just sort of, you know, take my hat off to all the people who are involved in doing this work on the vaccines.
And I think Dolly Parton, who's been funding some of it, but anyway.
Well, good for Dolly Parton as well. I mean, I think, as Andy put it, we had our forecast is conditioned on an improvement in treatments, and we use treatments as a sort of quite a broad term, because obviously that also includes, by the way, and there was some good news, was it yesterday or the day before, on treatments as well, with the news on also the Oxford, I think, developed treatment for those who suddenly do get it, that this would come through during the course of next year. Now, while we didn't, you're right, we didn't have the news on Pfizer and so on when we finalised the forecast. We did have, a broad expectation that we would be getting news positively, and our contact with the medical experts had said, certainly given the message that, as Andy said, that certainly by the time of our February forecast that we would have news on the vaccines. That news seems to come rather sooner, which is great. I think what we're now looking to is news on, actually, first of all, the manufacturing of them, because obviously you need a stable.
Yes, there's a huge logistical issue to get out
logistics,
to everybody.
Transport, manufacturing them, transporting them, and obviously then setting up the facilities to actually vaccinate. Now all of which, I think we can be reasonably optimistic that that's being addressed. But that's what we obviously need to see. I think what it does start to do, just picking up on a point Andy made, is that we've had an unprecedentedly high level of uncertainty in our forecast for obvious reasons in a way. And I think I would expect that this news and as it builds with further news on manufacturing and distributing, will start to reduce that uncertainty over time, and that's entirely helpful from the point of view of policy making in our world. So there are grounds for optimism. Obviously, we'll be following it very closely. We'll be looking for the further evidence of it. But there really are now, I think, there are very encouraging signs. The financial markets, by the way, Andy was referring to this. There's a bit of a tussle going on within financial markets at the moment, day to day, frankly, between what you can call positive news on the vaccine front and then the news on the incidence of COVID itself. So the short-term news that COVID numbers have been going up, although hopefully we're seeing some leveling off in this country at least, against the more positive news further out on the vaccine.
I wonder, just playing devil's advocate, Andy Haldane, because you said it was fantastic news, which of course all of us agree with, and we're all eternally grateful, hopefully, to all the scientists that have done the work in rapid time to produce vaccines, which we hope are going to be as efficacious as it looks like they're going to. But do you think, paradoxically, that the appearance of a vaccine sort of on the horizon might make people more complacent and actually cause a third wave in the early, maybe Q1 or Q2 next year, and do more damage?
I can see that certainly the possibility of that risk coming to pass. It was always a difficult needle to thread when it came to eliciting the right amount of caution among households and businesses. I mean, my general sense ahead of the vaccine news was that, if anything, people were a little too fearful of the future, and that uncertainty was having quite a significant dampening and damaging effect on their willingness to spend and their willingness to get out and about. I hope the vaccine news has helped offset some of that pessimism. If you look, for example, just the news we've had today. So today we had an announcement on the economy. It was a survey of purchasing managers, their views of activity in the economy in November. It tells quite an interesting story, actually, because the sort of the backward-looking views of businesses about activity for November, they fell and were quite gloomy. But some of the expectations looking ahead from November picked up and were more positive, reflecting that vaccine news. Overall, I'd say that is a positive picture if some of that excess caution and excess gloom were being offset by the vaccine news. Plainly, you would not want that to give way to people taking any chances until the vaccine is fully rolled out. So there's a balance to be struck there, but I'd say overall, this is a real positive. When I speak to businesses, when I was speaking to them pre the vaccine announcements, the thing about which they were most fearful, and this speaks to Andrew's uncertainty point really, was that they were in a sort of endless stop-go cycle as we had wave after wave punctuated by increasing restrictions. And that's a very difficult basis for planning if you're running a business. Indeed, it's a very difficult basis for planning if you're running a household either. And that's why that uncertainty was really so acute and such a sticking point for businesses when thinking about hiring and when thinking about investing. I do think the real significance of the vaccine announcements is that it can provide, I hope, a degree of assurance that that stop-go cycle will come to an end at some point in the foreseeable future. I think for businesses, that is all the difference in the world between viability and non-viability. And that's why I do think it's extremely good news for the economy overall. Thanks.
Sure. And Silvana, did you think that, given that we're likely to perhaps, if things work well, see a fairly thorough countrywide vaccination by, they're saying April, but I would suspect the middle of next year rather than April. 60 million times 2 injections is quite a lot to accomplish. Do you think that, given that there is some light at the end of the tunnel, that those sectors of the economy that have been particularly badly hit by social distancing, obviously hospitality and leisure, that it might be good if the Chancellor was to continue to support them throughout some of next year past March, so that once they can survive and still be there once the social distancing issues which have caused them such problems are actually overcome?
So I'll try to skip the direct question on fiscal policy because we try not to comment on fiscal policy, but let me make a general point.
Or would there be an economic logic to doing it?
So
Let me rephrase the question.
I think the confidence that there's a vaccine out there and there's light at the end of the tunnel gives a lot of strength and support for the argument for or the rationale for counter-cyclical policies. You know the end, and we know this shock is temporary, and we need to do as much as possible to avoid scarring effects from this crisis.
But would that be more effective if it was sectoral, given that there has been such an issue with particular sectors, and obviously one thinks of leisure and hospitality?
Yeah,
I agree. Is even better use of money, or are you arguing for just more general counter-cyclical policy?
No, well, given the very targeted nature of this shock, obviously targeted fiscal policies would be ideal. And I think, again, as you said, the fact that we have the certainty the vaccine will be there and eventually will be rolled out, then we can have more confidence on counter-cyclical targeted policies. I wanted to add to what Andy said, because I agree this is fantastic news for the medium term. For the next few months, however, the virus is still at large, and I'm not sure there will be so much complacency. The other worry is that there might still be social distancing, whether voluntary or mandated, in order to contain the virus. So it might be that we see weak spending and hence weak employment and in the coming months, and we have to worry about that. I'm obviously very happy and optimistic with the news, but I think the near term is still looking difficult and is I think the unwinding of those effects, especially on income and unemployment, will take longer than the direct effects of the virus.
Thanks, Chair. I think we're coming to that later.
Great, thanks very much, Angela. And going to Harriet, please.
Thank you, Mel. And Governor, I want to ask you about the upcoming end of the transition period. And I know you're assuming that a free trade deal is agreed before the end of the transition period. And even if that happens, your latest decision makers panels reports that I think only a third of firms are still partially prepared for leaving, and only 40% are as ready as they can be. I know you've downgraded your Q1 forecast by 1%, because even if there is a free trade agreement, you don't think that businesses will be able to adapt in an orderly way. Do you have particular intelligence on where the preparations are particularly lacking?
Yes, so we have, as you say, made that adjustment to the forecast, and we do, spend quite a lot of time talking to businesses about this question. Our regional agents have been particularly focusing on it, and will continue to focus on it in the next few weeks. You put your finger on something which we find quite commonly when we talk to firms, and which is sort of tantalizing in a way, which is a lot of firms will say, well, we're as ready as we can be, which of course leaves you wondering what can be really really means, because obviously it can mean quite a lot of things. And we've had to make obviously assumptions from that. We also use the surveys that obviously the major business groups do as well, and we talk obviously extensively to the major business groups. What does come through is that large firms report that they feel they are more prepared than small firms. So the SME sector, SMEs consistently tell us that they feel less confident and less well prepared than larger firms when we talk to them. That's one thing I would say. I think we also detect some difference in the confidence of responses depending on how directly affected a firm feels it is. So I think those who feel themselves most in the firing line have at least spent probably more time, thinking, planning and preparing, because they can see the really direct effects. Now, just one thing I'd note, and Andy was referring to this a few minutes ago. So one of the questions obviously we're also interested in is to what extent are firms preparing and taking actions to, in a sense, mitigate the effects of this. One thing we've been looking to see evidence of is whether there was the beginning of an increase in stock building and building of inventories, and possibly this morning, and Andy referred to the flash November Purchasing Managers Index, the indices that came out this morning. We may just be beginning to see the first sign of that happening in that survey that was published this morning. The final thing I'll say, if you don't mind me saying so, obviously, let me say, this question about disruption can also be mitigated by what I would call a spirit of goodwill on both sides in terms of the implementation of a trade agreement, should obviously one be agreed. And I've said many times I hope one is, because I think open economies are better for quite a few reasons. And I hope and I think, of course, it would be entirely beneficial if the implementation of whatever trade agreement took place within a spirit of goodwill, because that would ease some of these problems. Now, the UK government, of course, has said, or was committed actually, it's committed to implementing the new procedures over a period of time, actually not fully implementing them until next summer, in order to really accommodate that point. Obviously, if there was a common agreement to do that, then it would mitigate quite a bit, I suspect, of this effect that we have.
Governor, are you picking up on in your data any particular sectors that seem to your analysis to be less prepared? For example, in my constituency, it seems to be the horticulture sector that seems the most concerned about not being able to prepare because they just don't know what it is they're preparing for. I
don't honestly think we're getting a very strong message from a sectoral point in terms of particular hotspots. I think we're getting, in a sense, a broad range of responses which reflect the nature of the trade and the interaction that sectors do with the EU. We pick up, a number of the things that we obviously hear about in the news, such as rules of origin type rules as well. But you're right to point to something like horticulture, because again, there are particular, as I understand, not experts in that trade in that area, but there are particular standards issues that obviously will come into play when you don't have open markets.
So you think potentially 1%, even with a good free trade deal, covers all these sectors? What if there isn't a deal? What do you think the impact of that would be?
A no deal, obviously, in a sense, is World Trade Organization, WTO standards, and at that point we would expect a larger effect, both in terms of the impact on trade and the disruption to that trade that happens. And I would also say, I think unfortunately, it's probably a reasonable assumption that if we end up in that place, then the spirit of goodwill that I would be talking about would be less.
And do you see the risk to inflation being significantly different in either scenario?
Yeah, so I think obviously, first of all, the question of the impact on inflation will depend upon whether the shock to activity is how much of it is a supply effect and how much of it is a demand effect. So broadly, if it's a negative supply effect, that would have an upward effect on inflation. If it's a negative demand effect, it would have the opposite effect. Now, there are reasons to believe that probably the supply effect would be the larger one in that situation. So it would be more inflationary. The other thing I'll say at this point also is it does then depend also on what happens to the exchange rate, because that obviously also feeds through into inflation. There are reasons to think that broadly the exchange rate would depreciate in the event of an outcome that is worse than is currently expected. And there may be some upside on the exchange rate if the outcome is particularly if it's a sort of a trade agreement with goodwill around it.
And in your minutes, when you said the economy is starting from a position of greater spare capacity and weaker price pressures because of the COVID stuff, you're effectively you're saying that it reduces the likelihood of material trade-offs between the variability of output and inflation emerging. I mean, you could read that as saying that you're pledging not to raise rates under any scenario, really.
I wouldn't go that far. I mean, what we're saying is that we will obviously evaluate very carefully whatever effects come to pass, as it were, and we will evaluate them not just in terms of what we might call the raw movements in activity and inflation, but also how we see the trade-off, and also how we see that feeding through into inflation expectations. Because a very important element of this is, in some worlds, you can see this as a one-off shock to prices. For instance, if you have tariffs. So one big difference between a CETA style trade deal and a WTO trade deal is tariffs. Now, you then have to make the judgment: is that going to be a one-off change in the level of prices, which doesn't feed through into inflation expectations, or will it have some effect on inflation expectations? And we would have to make that judgment, and our policy setting would have to reflect the judgment we make, as well as you rightly say. Of course, obviously, we also have to factor in the situation we find ourselves going into this situation with currently an output gap.
But you must have done the analysis in terms of what the basket of goods would cost under WTO terms versus what it costs with zero tariffs.
Well, we've done a number of scenarios. I'm not going to say there is no precise answer to this question, but I'll just reiterate what I said. You're right to say, or right to say in the discussion we've had, that in a scenario where you go to WTO terms, let's say you have tariff effects, you may have negative supply effects, then you can see a positive shock to inflation coming through that.
And do you know how much that is?
No, you can come up with scenarios that put numbers around it, but it's hugely uncertain.
Can you give me a range? I mean, it's sort of what you've learned in the business of doing at the Bank of England.
I know. Well, I mean, you can certainly see, a percentage point on inflation, or perhaps somewhat more in some scenarios. What you then got to say is that going to be a one-off price level effect, which doesn't have second-round effects, or will it have second-round effects? That's the key judgment.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Governor.
Thanks very much, Harriet. Going to Rushanara, please.
Good afternoon. I'm going to just pick up a couple of questions on Brexit before I go on to unemployment and scarring effects. So, Governor, you've already talked about deal versus no deal. Can you just say what you make of the LSE analysis that suggests that the long-term economic hit will be 2 to 3 times as large as the COVID impact as set out by the Bank of England's forecast? Would you say, and then that would put it on a par with the 2018 numbers that the government's analysis suggests, is it all slightly above that, around 8%?
Well, I think the long-term effect would be larger than the long-term effect of COVID. Now, of course, by the way, I should say, and we may come on to the longer, you're going to come on to COVID and scarring, I think, as you mentioned, that of course both are highly uncertain.
Yeah.
I'm at the rather more optimistic end on the COVID front, and actually we are collectively relative to, say, the IMF. I think therefore there is reason to believe that in the event of as you say, a no deal outcome,
it was a question of him
the models
to a list. He did so after that, and it was all fine.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, I think Kenneth, you might have your microphone on. I might be wrong. I apologize if it's not you. Yeah, thank you. Sorry,
No, don't worry. So the models, just saying, I think you quoted the LSE model. The models would suggest that the longer term effects of a WTO no deal trade agreement are longer term. And the reason for that, I think, and this is pretty well established in the literature, is that it takes a much longer period of time for what I might call the real side of the economy to adjust to the change in openness and to the change in the profile of trade. I mean, I remember going right back in time to when we worked on if you remember long time ago, the 5 tests on whether it sounds like ancient history now. The 5 tests on whether the UK should join the euro area, believe it or not. And one of the things we developed in the bank, the model to work with the Treasury on that. So what it basically said was that, over a long period of time, so you could be talking 30, 40 years, you will eventually get convergence because the real side of the economy will adapt. You're going to change an activity of the economy, but it takes a long time. So it's hard to put a multiple on it, as you say, but I think you're basically right to say that in that scenario, you would expect a longer term effect from trade, from the exit trade agreement.
So just following on from that, I'm assuming sleeping at night is a bit of a challenge, both for you and the Prime Minister, if the prospect of no deal. As the prospect of no deal looms with an 8% loss of GDP, which you've just, if as you have said, the LSE model is visibly accurate, that's really worrying. So therefore, it's in our interest to get a deal. So how do you see, in terms of you were talking about implementation earlier, is there a case for, given the lack of preparedness, which we've seen in one of the sessions we've had, with businesses showing huge amounts of frustration and anger, which spilled out in reports over the last few days as well as previously, and not being able to prepare, plus the COVID pandemic and the second wave, is there a case, even if there is some sort of deal, and we're not expecting a completely frictionless deal with all this disruption, for a period for implementation because of the lack of preparedness? You mentioned, you touched on it earlier. Could you just confirm what your thoughts are on how we make that happen?
Well, first of all, you're right to say that there is no such thing as a frictionless deal, because obviously we're leaving the customs union, we're leaving the single market. So anything hereafter involves change, let me put it that way. We're not involved in negotiating trade agreements. I can't comment on that. And obviously, I also, as a public official, very studiously, I don't take a position on the substance of Brexit. But you're right. I mean, let me say, I've said a number of times, and many times actually, and I'll say it again, that I think, it is in the best interest of both sides, so both the UK and the EU, for there to be a trade agreement.
Yep.
And for that trade agreement to have, as I was just saying earlier, a strong element of goodwill around it in terms of how it's implemented. I think there's no question about that. In terms of my sleepless nights, which fortunately I don't have actually, but anyway, I mean, COVID obviously is a much bigger impact at the moment in the short run. But for all the reasons that you've given and we've just discussed, it would be better to have a trade deal. Yes, no question about that.
Okay, so moving on to COVID. In terms of the vaccine, which the unemployment forecasts came before then, is the bank factoring in some of the kind of hiccups we get in terms of, for instance, on testing and tracing? The fact that we didn't have that in place adequately has meant where we increased our likelihood of facing a second wave, and therefore the economic knock-on effect. Andy Haldane's prediction of a V-shaped recovery looked very much the case until we ended up in the second wave, and so that process of the response is undermining the economic recovery. Plus, of course, is the bank thinking about whether there are mutations and new variants of COVID going into the future, and how we make ourselves more resilient to coping with those sorts of threats? Sorry to sound like, prophet of doom, but just in terms of thinking about how we prepare and anticipate so that we're not going back and forth, because it's so frustrating for businesses, of course, but also those who face the spectrum of unemployment, who've already faced unemployment.
Yeah, well, I think obviously, going back to the answer to the previous question, obviously we do need to see, obviously, further, in a sense, evidence on manufacturing and distribution. And I think it's obviously well established that the Pfizer vaccine is more challenging on that front than the Oxford vaccine in terms of temperature issues, which I think affects certainly the distribution of it. So we do need to see, obviously, that evidence, and we'll be following that very, very closely. And that's why, as Andy and others were saying earlier, it's, we will remain, obviously, very watchful of how this timeline maps out against the timeline we've already got in the forecast, which goes across really next year. I'm not an expert on mutating viruses. I have talked to people. I think the interesting point here, and I can't offer you any view on it, but I'll state the issue. If it does mutate, I was certainly told this in the context of the mink issue. Of course, the question then is the mutation within the scope of the viruses that are, the vaccines, within the scope of the vaccines that are being developed, or does it take it outside the scope of the vaccines that are being developed? I think one thing that the experts, and I'm not one, have said to me is that I think it does point to the need to build on what terrific work that's been done this year to maintain that capacity to develop vaccines ideally as rapidly as they have been. Because if you remember back a few months ago, and certainly in the early days this year, we were being told that vaccines take, several years and sometimes never happen. So if you think back to that, this is terrific news. But I think that is certainly something that experts, and I'm not one, have said to me, which is it does indicate that globally we have to maintain the capacity to do this work.
Would perhaps others could come in? I just wondered whether there is a case for new ways of thinking about scenario planning and analysis with the kind of latter point in mind, so that the bank is factoring in, as you're doing with other risk issues, factoring in these, climate wasn't on the agenda in the way it is. It is now.
Well, I think that interestingly goes back to the point Silvana was making earlier about this new area of modelling, this epi-macro modelling, which I have to confess Silvana is umpteen times more expert on than I am. But I think what that is trying to do is say, how do you actually start to sort of, in a sense, link together macroeconomic modelling with epidemiological modelling? It is interesting when we talk, certainly when I talk to epidemiologists, there is quite a lot of common ground in terms of the sort of the challenges we wrestle with in terms of modelling. So I think you're right. That's it is a very interesting area of development. As we said to the chair earlier, we'll certainly send you something which summarises the sort of what we understand about that work to date. But it is moving along very rapidly, I would say.
Brilliant. Thank you, Governor. I've got a final couple of questions which I'll just do in one go for others to come in on. And this is in relation to the furloughing scheme. And obviously that's been extended. And earlier on, Andy Haldane talked about the uncertainties around business and preparedness and so on. What can we learn from sort of ensuring that the support schemes that are in place don't kind of end up being truncated and actually damage the wider economic outlook and employment? And then linked to this is the point about structural unemployment. Would you say, the analysis seems to suggest that there won't be, but when you take youth unemployment, expected to be at 1 million, would you say that we need to think about it in a more segmented way and better targeted intervention, not just Kickstart, which is the short term, it's only for 6 months, to address that particular aspect, or other forms of unemployment and structural impacts on certain groups? Perhaps Andy and then others.
I don't mind having first go. Roshna, just on my prediction of a V, of course, I never did quite predict a V, did I? I described the economy as recovering in a V-type fashion, but I didn't predict it was going to keep on along that path.
I was giving you, or perhaps I shouldn't have given you as credit then as I did.
Well, my one line, only ever I said one line on this, which was so far, so V, and the so far was the backward looking part. Just a small point of clarification. I mean, to your points, I do think the extension of the furlough scheme and the increased generosity of the furlough scheme relative to the job support scheme has been a real positive, both extending the period of insurance and making slightly more generous that insurance. I think it's good news for workers in terms of their lessening their degree of uncertainty and boosting their incomes, and has also been good news for businesses too, in providing them with a degree of assurance. And I hope and expect that degree of assurance and insurance would remain in place as long as the risks remain elevated. Certainly, those are all the indications the Chancellor has given. To your point on youth unemployment, you know, nothing weighs with me more heavily than that issue right now. We know that recessions hit hardest those that are youngest and those with fewer skills, and this one very much will be the rule rather than the exception on that front. We know the losses of income for young people that flow from entering the world of work in times like this can last for years, if not decades. So without going on to the specifics of schemes, I do think that is rightly a focus of policy attention to mitigate as far as possible those scarring effects, where the scars are plainly deepest and longest lived among younger people.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to come in? I'm conscious that my time's pretty much up. Michael.
Thanks. Yeah, I am worried about the hangovers from the pandemic, even if and when an effective vaccine is widely rolled out. There's the effects on the labour market, and we have already seen quite a sharp drop in employment among the 18 to 24-year-olds. We've got the prospect for a more significant rise in unemployment across the whole population in the spring. And there's also been a big rise in corporate debt. Corporate debt now is significantly higher than it was in previous years. And many households also have seen their savings depleted. Of course, the overall household savings rate has gone up. That's really concentrated at the top end of the income scale. At the bottom end of the income scale, many more households have seen their incomes weaken and their savings fall. And so we'll come out of this pandemic in a worse financial position. And I also worry about scarring effects on demand through risk aversion. I think until this year, the idea that the economy might suddenly fall 20% was unthinkable. It was not something that firms would factor into their planning. And having gone through this experience, I think that firms will look to have greater resilience in their balance sheets. They will be more cautious over borrowing, want to hold higher stocks of liquid assets than they did going into the pandemic. And that's likely to be reflected in greater caution over risk-taking, investment and hiring. So those aren't really, I mean, obviously it's better to have a vaccine than not, but those are hangovers from the pandemic, even as and when there is an effective vaccine, which I suspect will weigh on the economy for some time.
Silvana, on any of these points or earlier on when we talked about resilience, if you want to come in quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Michael. I'm particularly concerned on the effects on employment and income, which I think will keep dragging on the economy, even when the direct effects of the virus fade, thanks to the vaccine. So I am concerned about these longer-lasting effects. The extent of scarring, in some sense, it depends on the policy response. So the supportive policies that help bridge across this period will reduce those scarring effects and help avoid unnecessary business failures, defaults, and help support cash flows. So I think there is a strong role for policy to play here in bridging across this period. And with the confidence in the vaccine, we can do that more forcefully. So in some sense, what I'm saying is that the scarring effects are not written on stone. They can be affected by policy, and we should be acting to avoid them. Given that most of the businesses that were viable before should be viable post-vaccine. and same for the employment and the matches.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Roshanara. Going to Julie, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to carry on with the discussion, obviously, about these issues, but specifically how they relate to business investment, please. And perhaps I could turn first to the Governor for your views. Business investment often tends to be one of the most volatile components of the economy in recovery or recession. And in contrast to household spending, business investment has seen virtually no recovery at all in the third quarter. Is there anything that economic policy can do to restart investment, or are we totally dependent on resolution of the health crisis, so vaccine and so on?
No, it's a very good question. So two things on that. First of all, I think one of the most important things that we can do, and this obviously affects more than one front, we've been discussing both of them this afternoon, is to reduce the level of uncertainty. Because there is a well-established relationship, certainly in the economics literature, that the higher the level of uncertainty about the outlook for the future, the more negative the effect on investment, because it, in a sense, it increases the benefit of waiting to make the decision to invest. And it is true to say, I mean, again, I say this with no comment on sort of sense the substance of policy, that we have been living in a world of very high uncertainty in this country. COVID has obviously taken it to unprecedented levels, but we had higher uncertainty before that, to be frank, and that is obviously to a degree related to the finding a way through the implementation of Brexit. So reducing uncertainty on both of those fronts is I think a precondition of giving greater confidence for investment. The second thing, which I spoke about last week in some remarks I made, I think, is then the pressing need to ensure that we have a financial system, and particularly investment management, that can support long-term investment. And I'm very pleased that you may have seen that we, the Treasury and the FCA, have set off a piece of work with industry to look at what needs to be done to encourage and facilitate that level of investment. So I'm thinking here particularly about long-term holdings of equity investment in UK firms, because there's no question that coming out of COVID and implementing our new trading arrangements, we're going to need that investment. There will be firms that obviously come out of COVID with more stretched balance sheets, and we need to avoid a sector that has over excessive degrees of leverage. So I'm very focused and very determined to do everything that we can do, and this particularly falls into, by the way, the remit of the Financial Policy Committee and its work on productive finance, that we do everything we can to support sustainable investment in the economy. So we've already identified and outlined various areas that we will be sort of focusing on in that, in terms of particularly pension investment in pension funds, asset management vehicles, and indeed our own prudential rules, by the way, as to whether there are aspects of those that are acting to deter investment, because it is very important. So those will be important issues going forward, because you're right in your diagnosis of the investment situation.
When do you expect to have some kind of resolution or results of those kind of considerations?
Well, I suspect they'll come along in sort of, they won't come along in one go, actually, because I've just sort of outlined quite a wide-ranging set of issues. We've been actually working on it for some time. We announced it last week. We've been talking to particularly various bits of the financial services industry for quite a while, so then it's not unfamiliar to them. And you may remember the work that Citi UK have been doing for a while as well in that field. So I'm hoping that we've got a sort of, in a sense, a platform. We're certainly not starting from nothing. We've also got quite a lot of work internationally as well. So another thing that came out actually last week as well, was the Financial Stability Board's publication on the so-called dash for cash, or the instability that we saw back in March. And that too feeds into this work, because it goes to the question of what are sort of sustainable investment vehicles and what are not sustainable investment vehicles. So that we have some work internationally as well on that front. I'm very keen that we push it along, because frankly, we've got to be in a position where, and let's face it, we all hope this uncertainty is going to lift in next year, that then we're in a position to move ahead quickly and support industry and investment.
Thank you very much. And perhaps I can just seek, I mean, I don't know if Andy's got anything he would like to add to that, but also whether you think a lack of supply of credit has also contributed to that lack of recovery in investment in comparison with the fundamental lack of demand from firms.
Shall I maybe try and pick that up? Thank you. I think the question is very well placed, because it's clear that business investment has been the single largest missing ingredient from the recovery so far. The numbers make that absolutely clear, with business investment, 20–30% down on a year ago. We do a regular survey of credit conditions, which does ask about the extent to which this reflects a lack of demand for credit by companies or an absence of supply. I must admit, my sense so far has been this has principally been a lack of demand story, for understandable reasons, with uncertainty being as high as it has been, as Andrew mentioned. With uncertainty about future demand in particular being as large as it has been, it's understandable that businesses aren't actively seeking out credit, at least for investment purposes. Of course, companies have been borrowing in real scale over this period to tide over their cash flow shortfalls. They've borrowed more, this year, materially more than any of the preceding 4 or 5 years. So I think it's principally a demand side story rather than a supply side, although that is worth watching as we approach the recovery phase, because as we've seen in the mortgage market, there is heightened risk aversion and concern about credit risk on the part of banks vis-a-vis mortgages, and the self-same might be true when it comes to making loans available to companies. One last point on this. I think the uncertainty about demand will only resolve itself in the fullness of time. But there are some investments, business investments, could be made right now on a sort of no regrets basis, if I could say that. So we know that many businesses will need to make investments in the near future to improve their digital infrastructure, the digital kit, to prepare themselves for the new world of business. We also know that businesses will need to make some no regrets investments when it comes to greening their business model. So I do think there would be great virtue in the current environment as a way of adding some further strength to the recovery, if ways could be found to create incentives to bring forward those no regrets investment in digital and green in particular.
Andy, is that what you meant when you, oh, sorry, I'll come to you in a moment, Michael. Can I just check, when you mentioned, it was a really interesting phrase, the economics of chicken licking. Are you saying that is that what you're calling on firms to do, is to take that leap and make that, and not take on the uncertainty and address it full head on, I suppose?
Well, that comment in particular was just about what I sensed was a sometimes slightly imbalanced communication about the data flow we were getting on the economy, and with a little bit too much time dwelt on the negative news and insufficient on the positive. But the general point absolutely applies, that we should be at the moment doing all that we can as policymakers to provide a degree of insurance and confidence to business, to encourage them to bring forward those investments that are otherwise at risk of being backloaded. And the key point there is that then confidence and activity would be generally self-fulfilling in its impact on the recovery. So I do think there's something important there as a public policy matter about bringing forward investments that are otherwise at risk of being put on the back burner.
Thank you. Michael, you wanted to come in.
Yes, thanks. I wanted to highlight the extent to which, over the last few years as a whole, I think Brexit uncertainty has played a major role in dampening business investment. Since early 2016, up until the end of last year, so before the pandemic got going, business investment in the UK was up 1% over that period, and that's by far the weakest in the G7. Then obviously this year, the pandemic has hit business investment in all countries. Coming out of it, I think a major issue, and one of my worries, is the extent to which the corporate sector with higher debts now than it went into the pandemic with, whether that will make it harder for firms to obtain finance at relatively low borrowing costs, or whether they will be penalized for this debt burden which they've had to take on to carry themselves through the pandemic.
Well, that's most helpful, and I've run out of time, so thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Julie. And over to Felicity, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to ask questions on monetary policy and specifically on quantitative easing. Now, clearly at the November meeting, the MPC did unanimously vote for an extra 150 billion of quantitative easing. That was above market expectations. Why did you decide to go for 150 billion? And can you try and quantify that in terms of almost base rate equivalence, in terms of basis points, if I can express it in that way?
Well, do you want me to start on that?
Please, thank you.
Two things. First of all, obviously, we critically produce once a quarter an inflation forecast. And we obviously use that forecast to guide our policy decision on monetary policy, and that is obviously done with the intent of meeting the inflation target. And as you've probably seen from the forecast we produced, after taking into account the announcement on quantitative easing, we do have a central forecast, a model forecast, which takes inflation back to target around the horizon of the forecast, which is obviously the intent of policy. A lot of uncertainty around it, a lot of risk around it. So the mean forecast incorporating the risk on the is on the downside somewhat, but the model forecast does return inflation back to target, which obviously is what we're here to do, as it were. So doing that amount of QE, the new quantitative easing, was part of that judgment about what we needed to do to take the inflation forecast to target in the central case. Now, that's the first point. Second point then was, well, the second point I'll add to that, sorry, sort of point 1A and 1B, if you don't mind. Obviously, I would also say that in the run-up to the meeting, obviously we were in a world where, as we were discussing earlier, the incidence of COVID was increasing. The second wave was increasing rapidly, even before we obviously got to the lockdown. And so we were having to factor in the economic consequences of that as we were doing the forecast. And that's relevant then to the judgment about the scale of quantitative easing we had to do. But the second distinct thing I wanted to say was we also make, in terms of the way we structured the policy, the 150, we also announced that it would take effect over really most of the course of the next year, leading up to the latter part of next year, 2021. That is quite a long period. It's not unprecedentedly long, but it's quite a long period. It's longer than our previous recent announcements. And it was also, certainly speaking for my own part on this, it was done with the intent of giving greater confidence to market participants and to the economy more generally. Not only what is important with quantitative easing, which is the initial announcement on the scale of the intervention, but also confidence going forwards on what people can expect us to be doing. Doesn't mean to say, of course, we'll judge it when we every meeting, because we make policy meeting by meeting. So obviously we can vary it, but it was done designedly, I'm certainly speaking personally, with the intent of giving greater confidence in a time of great uncertainty. So those for me were the reasons why I thought we had to do something which was large and quite a decisive intervention. And I just finished by saying, I think over the course of this year, I've said it many times, I've said it in the remarks I made at the virtual Jackson Hole conference, we've had to use quantitative easing not only in scale, but also quite determinedly as a demonstration effect of our commitment to use policy actively.
And is there a limit to how much quantitative easing we can do? We're now up to 875 billion. How much more can you do?
Oh, sorry, did you say Andy or did you say me?
No, it was to you, sorry, yes.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Oh, how much can we, well, I mean, so I wouldn't want to say there is a particular limit. And I'll tell you why, because I remember being asked this question, I think at my confirmation hearing, which seems a bit like prehistory now, but it was back in February, I think, actually, maybe in early March. And we were operating in a world there. Mark Carney right now was essentially talking from the same script, I'll be honest with you, and saying what the headwind looked like in that pre-COVID world. And of course, that's changed a lot. And of course, it's changed a lot because the world's changed and the amount of debt that we can buy has increased. So I don't want to, in a sense, give a steer on what the future might look like in that sense. It will be guided by what we need to do in terms of the intervention. The remarks I made at Jackson Hole were, really, I draw 2 points out about that. One is, we think there is an element of what I call state contingency to quantitative easing, i.e., the effect of it can vary in different states of the world. And certainly back in March, it was probably at its most effective because we were using it not only to counter economic effects, macroeconomic effects, but also market uncertainty. That doesn't mean to say it doesn't have an effect, in today's world. Unfortunately, we don't face the same financial market uncertainty, but it does mean that whatever future interventions we make will be guided by that. Secondly, in terms of the way forward from here, whenever, and hopefully we do, in short order now come to the point when we are seeing a turn in the cycle, we obviously are going to have to look very carefully at what the implications of all this, because the Bank of England's balance sheet, as he said, is now heading well over 40% of UK GDP. I think it's actually 895 billion because there's 20 billion of corporate bonds as well, but there's 875 billion of government debt. It's a very big number. And obviously this year's interventions are now at 450 billion pounds of announced interventions. We won't obviously say execute them all until well through next year, but that's a huge intervention. Bank of England balance sheet is now its highest level ever and highest level, I think, related when indexed to GDP. So we are going to then have to start thinking about when we get to that point, how we adjust back. But for the moment, I would say, we still have more tools, and more things we can do if we need to do them.
Yes. Let me move on to Andy now. Andy, in June, you voted against the increase in quantitative easing. Obviously, in November, you voted for the 150 billion. Had you known about the good news on the vaccine front, would you still have voted in the way that you did in November?
Tough to know for sure, because my November vote and everyone else's November vote came off the back of us having gone through a very long and very involved forecast round by which we evaluated all the effects on the economy. I haven't done that yet for the vaccine. None of us have done that yet for the vaccine. The time to true up on all that stuff will be February. So I think it's hard to run the kind of what if experiment for how I might have voted had I known the vaccine news then. I'd just say two things though. One is just try and answer more directly the question you asked at the beginning, which is what is the marginal effect of the 150 billion? Roughly speaking, the ready reckoners we've historically used for QE have been that 10 billion pounds of QE buys you the equivalent of 10 basis points in terms of interest rates, which would lead you the 150 billion that we announced in November would have been the equivalent of 1.5 percentage points off bank rate. Now, truth be told, they were ready reckoners from a time when the world was a bit simpler than what it is right now, and certainly at a time when interest rates were materially higher than what they are right now. When our sense of the incremental effect of a dollop of QE now is somewhat lower than would have been the case in the past. I think a better way to think about the 150 extra QE in November was as an insurance policy. It was as a safeguarding device to prevent any premature rise in borrowing costs across the economy for companies and for households, and which would otherwise have put at risk that recovery that I mentioned earlier on. And that really was the motivation for me and maybe for some others voting for the extra QE in November. We'd seen the risks realized for the economy as a result of the second wave and the accompanying restrictions. Extra insurance was called for to provide a bridge between now and those improved treatments and prospectively vaccine coming on stream. You know, was that judgment finally balanced for me in November? Yes, it was. I was weighing up. I thought more insurance was needed, but I was weighing up a larger package and a smaller package. I went for the larger package on the grounds that the virus was picking up pace faster than anyone expected. We had just approached a national lockdown, and the bridge we needed therefore needed to be somewhat longer than I'd thought previously.
Great, thank you. And I've only got 1 minute left, so maybe if Silvana or Michael want to add anything on QE, and maybe any thoughts in particular about the fact that we're hearing that QE, we're not getting the same bang for our buck, if I can use that terminology. So should we be using it as much going forwards?
Yeah, for me, the rationale for the recent QE expansion, as Andy said, was an insurance motive. It was a preventive measure to avoid any tightening in monetary conditions. And going back to your initial question, Felicity, for me, the appearance of the vaccine makes it even more essential that we avoid those risks. We need to bridge the economy to a time in which demand is able to recover, and so we need to support the economy to get there. So I think, again, QE was done as a preventive measure, and we should keep it in order to avoid any tightening in monetary conditions, which would be very damaging now that we know that those furloughed workers can more confidently go back to their jobs, and businesses that were viable before should be viable post-vaccine. And the context is very important. We are undershooting the target. So you were asking about the limits of monetary policies. We are way below our target of inflation, so there's a lot of margin to stimulate demand there. In terms of getting the bang, it's true that with long yields so low, the effectiveness or the power of QE is much lower. So for me, it's not so much the boost to activity right now. It was more the insurance motive to avoid any tightening in conditions that would damage the overall economy and get on the way of us achieving the remit.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Felicity. I'm going to come to Steve in a moment, but I'm just going to quickly ask one quick question of Andrew, actually, just following on from Felicity's question. So you said earlier that there were circumstances in which you could imagine inflation spiking up, maybe around the if there was a no deal and tariffs and supply side constraints, and also a depreciation of the pound that might be consequent on that happening. Is there any risk here that and other factors combine to suddenly mean that inflation spikes up and stays up at a sort of level that actually starts to severely question whether any further QE is appropriate?
Yeah, so that's the judgment we would have to make. And I mentioned earlier about the path of inflation expectations, because what we obviously would be seeking to avoid there, as you rightly suggest, is avoiding second round effects where the initial spike in prices becomes embedded in inflation expectations, then obviously gets embedded in the labour market, for instance, into pay settlements. And we've been there before, as we say. So that's what we would have to be watching out for very carefully. And that will be a judgment we will have to make if we do have to make it. And it's obviously I think, you can tell from history, it can be a very challenging judgment to make when you're trying to sort of, in a sense, in real time, sort out the difference between what's going to be limited to a first round price level adjustment, if you like, and what is going to get embedded into expectations and become second round. And that would be challenging, but we would have to make that judgment.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Oh, sorry, Michael wants to come in.
So yes, I just want to stress a point that we start with an economy which has a significant amount of spare capacity. The level of GDP is 10% down from the end of last year. That was the position in the third quarter. The shortfall in GDP will be greater now in the fourth quarter, given the various signs that the economy has weakened. The labour market has plenty of slack. We see a lot of firms doing pay freezes or lower pay deals this year. The economy is not on the cusp of higher inflation. If anything, it is the opposite. Now, there are various factors. In the event of a no-deal Brexit, there are various factors which could cause a temporary rise in inflation. Tariffs, exchange rates. But that kind of outcome would probably also produce even more spare capacity in the economy, which would give us more persistent disinflationary pressures going forward.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Michael.
And if I may add one more thing, I mean, in terms of tariffs, the effect from WTO tariffs are bounded. If you think about, you know, the range we have in WTO, the share of imported goods in the basket is around 30%. So I would say 1 percentage point would be the absolute maximum. And so that's very bounded. And we are starting off from 0.7%. So this is the risk, of course, with exchange rate depreciations, there might be more there, but in terms of tariffs, there's no really, and this would be a one-off level effect.
That's all been very clear. Thank you very much. Thank you. Can I go to Steve, please?
Thank you, Chair, and I refer to my shareholding in Glintpay. I just want to pick up on the questions about QE and start to verge into some of the issues of MMT, modern monetary theory, as it comes up. So you're heading towards 875 billion of QE. Can you just remind us what the total amount of M4 outstanding is, more or less? Governor?
I have to be honest with you, Steve, I don't have that off the top of my head.
It's about 2 trillion. I just checked earlier. I mean, I might have looked at the wrong series, but I looked at LPMV, QXV, and I think it's about 2 trillion. That's what I expected it to be. So that means you're doing quite a lot of QE as a proportion of the money supply, aren't you? What does that actually mean?
If you look at, certainly, if you're right, if you look at there's an interesting chart actually, I'm happy to send you if you want, which actually relates what you might call the stock of central bank money, which is the stock of QE plus notes, our balance sheet, if you like, to the stock of broad money, which is your, and over time, and it's pretty interesting actually. Actually, here's the interesting thing. Takes it back to about where it was in the 1950s, if I remember rightly, but of course, hugely different levels. But it's quite interesting from the point of view of the financial system, actually.
Yeah, well, I'd certainly be very interested in seeing it. I'm just really observing that
dig it out and send it to you.
The numbers and the proportions are now such that it seems to be stimulating all sorts of interesting ideas about how people think the monetary system ought to work. One idea which somebody brought to my attention earlier is this question of why don't you just write off the bonds when they've been bought by the asset purchase facility? Could you just remind people, Governor, why is it that we don't just write off the bonds when they've been bought by the asset purchase facility?
Well, you'd have a huge hole in the Bank of England's balance sheet if you don't mind me saying so.
So I'm not proposing it as an idea. I'm saying it's an idea. As I understand it, the modern monetary theorists seem to be suggesting that the central bank should inject money, and then when inflation comes in, it should be taxed away somewhere else. I'm just trying to put on the record for them, why is it we don't write off these bonds?
As I read the modern monetary theorists, I mean, they basically say you should go on using that mechanism until, you know, you get the sign of inflation, and then you should sort of, in a sense, stop. And, you know, as I think we've just been discussing in the answer to the last set of questions, well, you know, if only life, you know, well, I'm not saying I'm an advocate of it, but by the way, if only life was that simple, if you are an advocate of it, unfortunately, I think history tells us that life isn't that simple, actually. But and you can see this, by the way, you know, you've seen a little bit of debate between you know, Michael Savannah and me on the question of inflation. I mean, you know, this is not a straightforward question to answer by any means.
Professor Tenreiro, can I ask you, what is your judgment of modern monetary theory, please?
I should refer to Willem Boyter. He defined, or he referred to it saying that the good things in MMT are not new, and the new things are not so good. I think there are, you know, many sensible ideas there. So as a general rule, you expand demand until you hit inflation, and they have in mind, I think, 2% inflation. But then the part that is harder to sort of agree with is the bit that you can do stabilization of inflation later on by moving taxes. And that's really difficult to implement in real time, as they suggest. I also don't agree with the fundamentals behind why people work and why and the taxing that they have in mind. So they think we work in order to pay taxes or something like that. I mean, this is based on Stephanie Kelton's book on the deficit. I think more generally, the problem with MMT is that sometimes it's very difficult to pin down because there's a lot of talk, but there's no clear model with assumptions and implications. And so in some sense, there's no discipline that can guide us as to, okay, what is being assumed, what is being derived as a result of those assumptions. So I think, again, there are some good intuitions here and there in the theory, some helpful guidance. Okay, don't withdraw demand too early, but if you haven't hit the inflation target, for example, and I would agree with that, but I don't agree with them in the tools beyond that, because I just don't think they're as helpful as monetary policy tools.
Thank you very much indeed. Andy, I'm going to, if I may, forgive me, Mr. Saunders, I'll just give Andy the last word on this, because I know you're a very deep thinker. What is your take on modern monetary theory, or perhaps rather I should say, what's your what is your message to the modern monetary theorists?
Well, I think as Silvana mentioned, there are elements of this that make some sense. My problem with it comes in three forms. One, it's not modern. Two, it's not monetary. And three, it's not really theory. So it's not modern because it's the oldest trick in the book. We've seen that trick repeated many times through history. Typically hasn't ended very well. It's not especially modern because in essence it's about the intertemporal budget constraint of the government. In other words, the fiscal act dressed up as a monetary one through the consolidated balance sheet of the government sector. And three, it's not really theory because this is a trick that can be pulled off once in a one-shot game, but in a repeated game you find that the good gets undone. And that's why, Steve, I'm a skeptic.
That is a huge relief. I can't.
Steve, can I make one more point?
Of course you can, Governor. I'm loving it.
No, it just follows. So we're all going to pile in now, but it just follows what Silvana was saying. You see, I've said this before in our previous hearings that what we've done on quantitative easing is only possible because we are a credibly independent central bank.
Yes.
When you read, I've read Stephanie Kelton's book as well. You know, she doesn't believe in independent central banks. I cannot conclude from her book that she believes in independent central banks. So it falls apart on those grounds as well.
Yes, for what it's worth, I've read a lot of Ludwig von Mises, and I'm not sure whether he supports a full reserve or central or fractional reserve banking, or indeed having central banks. But that's by the by. Mr. Saunders, how's it all going to end? How's it all going to end? How is the Bank of England going to get out of this enormous amount of quantitative easing?
I think it depends on what the economy does. If the economy strengthens, if it turns out, let's say, just for the sake of argument, stronger than expected in the November MPR, then capacity use will rise. Subsequently, inflation pressures would increase. Under that scenario, which is not my base case, by the way, but under that outcome, you would expect us to tighten policy. And we have showed in the past we are willing to tighten policy promptly if necessary. If necessary. So the commitment to the inflation target, it's a symmetric target. It encourages us to loosen policy when the economy is depressed and has plenty of spare capacity, but it also ensures that if necessary, we tighten policy in order to keep inflation low over time. It's a symmetric target. We take that strictly.
So the point I'm really making as we work our way, or trying to extract perhaps, is that as we work our way towards this big fiscal event we've got coming up at the spending review, is that we should eventually expect QE to be unwound still. Is that right, Governor? We should still expect these bonds to be put back in the market. You're nodding for the record.
Well, yes, QE, I think, will need to be unwound over time to the point where the level of central bank reserves is consistent with what I might call the sort of stable, continuous demand for them. The reason I say that is because, just a bit of history. So pre-financial crisis, The Bank of England ran monetary policy with a level of reserves, which, if I'm right in saying, was about something like about 20, just under 30 billion pounds. It was very low. Unfortunately, it didn't factor in the need for them because of financial stability. Financial stability is there's a whole second reason for central bank reserves. So there's no question that post-financial crisis, the level of our balance sheets and level of reserves is going to be substantially higher than it was pre-financial crisis. And we have not got to the point, because we've never had to address this question post-financial crisis of finding out really what that level of reserves is. Now, interestingly, the Federal Reserve had an interesting experience sort of a year or so ago, where they had a sudden spike in the overnight interest rate when it appeared that the sort of combination of the level and distribution of reserves was getting to a point when it was hitting the target, even though it's vastly bigger than it was pre-crisis. So our level of our balance sheet will be bigger on a sustained basis, but it will be lower than it is today.
I thought this question was sufficiently important to have a good trot round it, but Chair, I have now used up all my time, I believe.
You have, but I think you enjoyed every second of that, Steve. So.
I certainly did, and if I could have twice as much, I would certainly use it. In fact, if the bank wants me to pop round for an extra session, I'm glad to do that too.
We'd love you to come around and we can discuss one visas.
Oh, fantastic.
Fantastic, even better. Okay, thank you. And now going to Siobhan, please.
Thank you. I'd like to look at mortgage interest rates. Even though you're cutting rates and printing money, retail interest rates on mortgages have risen further since the summer, especially on low deposit mortgages, which is throwing first-time buyers out of the market now, but now spreading to higher deposits. Is this a sign of dysfunction in the mortgage market or an appropriate response to credit risks?
Well, I'm happy to start on that one. So you're right, that what we've seen over the course of recent months is quite different moves in the mortgage market. So the effects of interest rate cuts that we've made this year have come through in what I call low LTV floating rate mortgages. You're right that what has happened though is that the high loan to value ratios, particularly the 95% loan to value ratios, the market has tightened considerably, both in terms of the pricing of those mortgages and the products on the market. I think. Let me also just add that, by the way, there is no lack of supply of mortgage lending in this country. Actually, the housing market activity in the housing market is at highest levels since before the financial crisis. So the overall flow of mortgage lending is very high, but it is tightened at as you rightly say, at the high LTV end. And that's important because, as you rightly say, most likely you've got a concentration of first-time buyers at that end of the market. Why is it? I think one big reason at the moment, and we are, by the way, I should say, we are beginning to see in the last week or two, a few weeks, some reappearance of certainly 85% LTV mortgage products. But I think the reason is that there is such uncertainty about the path of house prices. Now, of course, actually, the path of house prices this year has been much stronger than you might have thought it would be. In fact, actually, in September, I think we saw one of the fastest ever increases in monthly increases in house prices we've seen. But I think certainly when we talk to people in the market, they are very uncertain about the path of house prices, and particularly once the stamp duty effect obviously goes away. Now, that will feed through into the supply of high LTV mortgages, because obviously high LTV mortgages are the ones that are more likely to go into negative equity in the event of a correction in house prices in the future. And while that uncertainty exists, there's a second area of uncertainty that I'll come on to in a moment, but while that uncertainty exists, there will be a lot of caution in terms of that end of the market. The second area of caution, of course, goes back to what we've been talking about earlier, which is the outlook for the economy as a whole, and obviously the outlook for income and unemployment. I think there I would also, and obviously that's highly uncertain. I think the other thing that I would add is that I think lenders have been, I mean, they've had to make judgments on mortgage applications where there is greater uncertainty than usual on future income. So if people are on the furlough scheme, for instance, lenders have to decide, well, are they going to return to their usual level of income, their usual employment, sorry. If they've been taking mortgage holidays, which is a good thing, by the way, I think it's been an important device for sort of, in a sense, smoothing the impact of the shock we've had this year. but if you know if there is a new application for a mortgage which indicates there has been a mortgage holiday at some point in the course of this year, what does the lender conclude about that? So there is a lot of uncertainty around, and I think again we need to move to a point where that uncertainty is reduced. And I suspect then that the housing market the mortgage market will start to crack, because there's no shortage of supply of mortgage lending.
Unless you're a first-time buyer that needs a 90 or
unless you're concentrating that end of the market, yeah.
And without your first-time buyer, the whole, then you're just supporting second property owners, buy-to-let landlords, and for most of the MPs on this at this committee, that's not really who they want to see most supported.
I agree with that.
Is the ongoing rise in mortgage rates hampering the transmission of monetary policy?
Well, I think it has to, as I said, to be set against the fact that the level of activity in the housing market and actually the level of lending in the mortgage market is at very high levels. So there's no shortage of activity in the housing market at the moment in terms of transmission of monetary policy. I think you're making a point, however, which is correct. It somewhat goes back to the question Rishna Ali was asking earlier, which is right, which of course, unfortunately, when you look at the research on the impact of COVID itself, it is skewed towards those with lower incomes, the young, actually there's gender skew in it as well, actually, when you look at the impact of COVID in terms of incomes. There may well be an ethnicity skew as well. So yeah, there are these effects going on. Now, monetary policy has its limitations in terms of what it can do in response to that, I'm afraid, but we do observe those distributional issues, yeah.
I would just add quickly that there's no sign that the transmission mechanism is impaired. Risk has increased, as the governor said, because there's house pricing risk, because there's employment risk, income risk, and it's natural that would be reflected in the pricing of higher risk mortgages. And that's what, in some sense, monetary policy tries to offset. But there's no causality to be drawn from the higher risk premium and mortgage rates to the transmission of monetary policy. It's the other way around. Monetary policy is acting against those forces, if you want.
Okay, yes, sorry, Michael.
Yeah, no, I think this is quite an important point. The transmission of monetary policy is working as normal, but recessions have hangovers. And those hangovers partly take the form of wider credit spreads, caution over lending. You see that in the mortgage market. I think you may see it once the government support schemes come to an end, also in the corporate loan market. And that hangovers from recessions is one of the reasons why recoveries, you don't usually bounce back immediately to where you were.
Thank you, Michael. This question is to all the members of the panel and actually takes on board some of the points you just made. And that is soaring demand for housing suggests buyers are bullish about house prices. Rising interest rates suggest that lenders are concerned about price falls and possible defaults. Are you concerned about the disconnect and who is right?
Who would like to come in first on that? Do you want to direct the question, Siobhan, to anyone in particular?
Happy for anybody on the panel to answer.
It looks like you might have to choose, I think.
All right then, Governor.
Governor.
The buck stops with you.
Sorry, well, are we concerned about, your question is, are we concerned about the overall impact of this?
But, no, people were just saying that demand for housing and mortgages suggests people are bullish about house prices, but rising interest rates suggest that lenders are concerned about the future and price falls and possible defaults. Are you concerned about the disconnect between these two? Who is right?
I think it comes back to the fact that we were talking about earlier. This is quite a segmented market at the moment. So the demand, the strength of the market is in the lower LTV, lower loan to value end of the market, where house prices are rising. And I don't think, therefore, people who are in that segment of the market are observing the sort of the same type. They're observing tightening of lending rates. I mean, at that end of the market, actually, the transmission of monetary policy has worked pretty much as expected. The cuts we made, interest rate cuts we made earlier in the year have passed through. So that end of the market, I think if you're in that part of the market, you're not observing the same effect. So it is, I think the answer to your question is it's a very segmented market. So if you're in that sort of what I might call mainstream part of the market, you're not looking at the higher LTV end of the market because that's not the market you're in. You know, you're not in that position, and I don't think you put yourself in that position. Obviously, if you're trying to get a mortgage with a 5% deposit, let's say, then you see it very differently. I mean, the other thing I would just observe, if you look at higher LTV lending rates over the last 5 years, we have seen a very strong increase in competition in the mortgage market over the last 5 years, which has brought rates down actually beyond any cuts in the Bank of England official rate. And one reason for that actually was the ring fencing changes, which have increased the supply of lending into the domestic mortgage market, and so has increased competition in the domestic market. Now, if you put it into that perspective, if my memory is correct, at the high LTV end, I think the increase in rates has taken us back to about where we were in 2015. So it is worth putting it also into that perspective, that the competition effects that go on in mortgage markets are also a feature of driving the spread over the official rate.
I wanted to add to the governors two forces that have been also boosting demand in the housing market. One is people reassessing their housing needs and rebalancing their commuting needs through the pandemic. So there has been a surge in the demand for houses with a garden, for example. And the other one is the stamp duty holiday, which also probably boosted, and because that's perceived as temporary, it would generate a bigger short-term boost in demand. And set against that, there are the supply factors that the governor discussed. But it's not who's right or who's wrong. There is demand and supply, and these things are moving at the same time.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Great, thanks, Siobhan. Going to Alison, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I've got some questions around the greening of the Bank of England for the Governor initially, but happy to bring other people in. So in your recent speech, Governor, to the Green Horizon Summit, you acknowledged that the bank's short-term interventions did not discriminate on the basis of climate change. Can you explain a wee bit more why you felt that was the right course of action, given the potential long-term impact of the financing involved?
Yes, no, I'm happy to do that. I mean, I felt that two things back in March. First of all, I think given the crisis we were facing, given the fact that, as Andy said early on, we had a 20% fall in the level of GDP, which is absolutely unprecedented in the economy, and that called for very big and very fast measures, both from the Bank of England and obviously from the government and fiscal policy. Given that it was clearly putting at risk many jobs, I don't think that we can turn around to people, ordinary people, and say, well, I'm sorry that you work for a company that isn't really where we want you to, where it should be from the point of view of the green economy and climate change. So you're not going to benefit from support in this crisis. I just think that is, I think I use the word unconscionable. It really is. Even though, and here, because I've had a lot of correspondence, a lot of we've had some protests outside the Bank of England, and it doesn't in any sense take away our support for the objectives of climate change. But I just felt in that situation, it would be unconscionable to say to people, "I'm sorry, you're just working for the wrong sort of company, and I'm sorry, the economy is going off a cliff, but we're not going to help you," and that just doesn't seem fair. It just fails a test of fairness.
I would certainly agree from the point of view of having Aberdeen, for example, and the oil and gas investment there. But could there not have been more structured support to support both those jobs and the green transition into those new industries?
Yes. So what I remember saying at a hearing, again, a sort of prehistoric hearing back in February or March, that I do want us to investigate and I do want us to move on from by the way, our £20 billion corporate bond portfolio, which is the bit between the 875 billion and the 895 billion. That bond portfolio, we are neutral buyers in the sense that we have bought essentially according to the index of essentially the weighted average of corporate bonds in issue in sterling markets. We don't discriminate. Now, I do want us and think that we should move towards having green objectives, climate change related objectives, and that's what and by the way, as we've announced, we've started work on that. But it's not an easy question, and it does require some pretty careful thinking. And let me explain why. You can obviously take what I might call a rather binary view and say, well, let's just come up with a sort of a measure of greenness, for want of a better word, and allocate the portfolio that way. But that really doesn't actually get to what we want to achieve, because obviously what we want to achieve is to support, what Mark Carney's made many times, to support the transition of the economy to being consistent with climate change objectives. To do that, we've got to have a portfolio which actually enables and incentivizes companies to make that transition. So just investing in companies that are sort of quite green doesn't do it in that sense. Now, and that's why I'm very cautious about some of the what are so-called taxonomies that have been produced, and the European Commission's got one, because they risk this sort of binary outcome and they don't support transition. So what I want us to do is to think about how can we actually support transition. But then, of course, you've got quite a difficult judgment in there as to, well, who is, who's able to transition and who isn't, as it were. And it's not easy, but that's the work we're doing, and we will do. And we'll be very transparent, and we'll be very transparent with the committee on what we're doing.
Okay, thank you. You've previously committed to working with the Treasury to ensure that corporate bonds are bought as part of quantitative easing are not contributing to climate change, and Sarah Breeden repeated that commitment to us recently.
Yes.
Does there need to be more done to perhaps change the bank's remit? And if the government did that to explicitly reflect climate change, how would that help the bank in taking that policy forward?
Well, that's something we're talking to the Treasury about, because it would be possible to, I think, to make actually probably a reasonably straightforward change in the. It's actually probably the remit letter that we get from the Chancellor, which would do that. But we're talking to the Treasury about that, and again, we'll come back to you on that when we're making progress.
Okay. Would there need to be further legislative change to
put
this forward in any way?
I don't think so. No, I don't think it needs to.
Okay, I'm just sort of trying to seek out if there's any particular barriers.
No, it's a good question, because actually it's a very good question, because actually when we first thought about it, we asked ourselves that question. And I mean, we haven't definitively concluded, but I think we've got to the point of concluding actually it doesn't need legislation.
Okay, thank you. Can you tell me a wee bit more about the climate stress test that you said will go ahead in June 2021? Can you explain a wee bit more what kind of scenarios you'll be using and what outcome you hope to get from the stress test?
So we're going to use three scenarios. And the three scenarios are basically that change starts, straight away, as it were. That we have a course of change towards meeting the climate goals, which is consistent with meeting them. The second scenario will say, what if that change is delayed? And the third scenario is, what if it doesn't happen? So those are the three broad scenarios. Now, the thing I'd say about what we're going to do with them. So it's not a classic stress test. It's not designed to sort of adjust a capital ratio on a bank. It's far more about what I call risk management considerations. So we're really getting at how do banks risk manage their balance sheets and their exposures consistent with those climate change objectives. And by the way, and again, a point Mark has made many times, which is consistent again with transition, as well as actually the sort of static point in time balance of asset portfolios. So it's risk management, it's the impact of those portfolios under certain scenarios going forward to show to institutions what will be the consequences, frankly, in the two less good scenarios if they don't risk manage their scenarios. So that's really the sort of primary focus of it. It's actually a tool to ensure that banks are risk managing and therefore taking investment decisions and asset decisions which are consistent with frankly, beneficial outcomes for them, but also consistent with achieving the climate change goals.
Okay, and what happens if they fail the stress test?
Then it won't be strictly a pass-fail, but if they don't meet the terms, then we will obviously have very focused discussions with them. And we will, I mean, it's also, by the way, it's a tool for them to use as well to say, okay, so how do we, we reorientate our management of our, risk management going forwards and our balance sheet management going forwards. Because I mean, it will be for all of us. It will be quite an interesting sort of, in a sense, show and tell, as it were. This hasn't been done before. No other country's done this.
Yeah, it's very interesting in terms of what you're measuring and whether you're measuring the correct things and whether or not there's an effect in having done it.
And I think, as Sarah Green said to you, we will learn a lot from this, and it will no doubt cause us to adapt some of the things we do.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, are you considering implementing a sort of brown penalising factor on polluting investments into the capital regime for firms?
No, we're not, that's not part of this. That's not part of the testing. This set of stress tests. We've not got to that point yet.
Okay, that's useful. I don't know if anybody else has anything quick they want to bring in on any of these. No, thank you very much.
Thanks, Alison. And finally to Mike, please.
Thank you, Chair. Going to talk about the Sun newspaper, not literally, but about the 150 billion indemnity increase and the alleged leak. I mean, Governor, in the early hours prior to publication of the latest Monetary Policy Committee minutes, the Sun newspaper, as you know, printed a headline, and it read, bank dishes out another 150 billion. It's been described in a Bloomberg article as being something like the Bank of England's worst leak in almost a quarter of a century of monetary policy independence. Do you agree with that sentiment?
I take it very seriously, and it is a very serious issue, and I can tell you that we have an investigation going on to get to seek to get to the bottom of what happened. So I do take it extremely seriously. I can't give you any information on that investigation at this stage, but I can tell you that it is very much going on. I would say you're right to use the phrase alleged. Now, let me say this: we have to assume that, because I want you to be clear with you that we take this as seriously as it can be taken. There is an interpretation, which some people have given me, which is it wasn't a leak. It was frankly based on two things, really. One, actually, as I mentioned earlier, that there were some people in the market who had shifted. I mean, the market as a whole, for some time prior to the meeting, had been thinking we were going to do £100 billion of QE. The market obviously forms every time we meet. The market has an expectation of what they think we're going to do, and it's not based on anything from us. It's based on their, second guessing, frankly. And there was some evidence in the days prior to the meeting that because of the shift in the severity of COVID, that some economists, particularly market economists, would begin to shift their numbers upwards, or thought we might do that. The second thing, which as you probably know, is that we moved the time of the announcement at quite short notice, actually the day before, to 7 o'clock in the morning from our usual midday. And the reason for that was because the Chancellor, at rather short notice, was making a statement in the Commons at the same time. And as I understand it, but you're the experts on this, not me, there is no sort of, the Commons timetables are quite fixed, as it were, in terms of what that. And it was clear to me that having both me and the Chancellor making different statements at the same time, it's not a very good thing to do. We've certainly never done that. We've always, what we always avoid, we avoid it as a normal course. I mean, in this situation, it was just an event that happened. It is possible, therefore, that people read more into that than they should have done, because it wasn't in any sense signalling anything other than avoiding a clash of statements. I put those two things together and concluded that we were doing something different. But let me reiterate, I do not assume that, because what we have to assume is that it was a leak, and therefore we have to try and get to the bottom of it.
Yes, and you confirmed that there is an investigation ongoing, but you couldn't, by any chance, state when we would get to know the outcome of that investigation?
Unfortunately not, because unfortunately, like all investigations, I can't give you a clear read on when we're going to get to the end of it, frankly.
Okay. As a consequence then, can you outline the kind of security protocols now around monetary policy announcements? How many people have prior knowledge, for example? Who knows what and when? I know you just touched on it, but there must have been changes in that respect.
Well, we have very high security around it, which is why, as you say, I mean, we've had sort of 23 years of operating, and you know, the Monetary Policy Committee has had a very high record. And by the way, you know, the Bank of England, in my view, has a very strong record on leaks, which, you know, I and my predecessors, you know, put enormous value on and take extremely seriously. It's a very small number of people involved in the process. It's not a very large, for obvious reasons, it's not a very large number of people. Now, obviously, we will also, as you can imagine, be looking at the processes to see if there are points there where, even if they weren't the cause of anything happening, we can tighten them up.
Yeah, I mean, it's been noted that a Treasury official sits on the in all MPC meetings. What kind of security arrangements have you agreed with the Treasury as to what they are allowed to do with the information that they gather, gain from attending those meetings?
Again, by the way, I mean, that arrangement with the Treasury is provided for in the legislation, and it's a very sensible arrangement. It's been there since the origin of the Monetary Policy Committee in 1997, so there's nothing unusual and new about that. We again have strong arrangements with the Treasury, and let me be clear, I'm not pointing the finger at the Treasury, so please don't conclude from that. But in any sense I am. Those arrangements, again, have been very robust over time.
No, neither was I. It's just that we're conscious that before this, you and the Treasury had a correspondence. You've got a very clear working relationship, and you yourself personally were in correspondence with the Chancellor. So we just need to be reassured that those security protections and workings are in place. But you know, Governor, at the end of the day, your predecessor appeared before this committee about two very serious leaks that had happened under his watch, which flagged up broader issues within the branch's handling of market-sensitive information. Should we draw a link between these events? Is there a pattern, or are you on top of it? And is your security now robust enough to minimise and prevent such occurrences again?
I don't think that's absolutely fair of you to say that. I don't think there's any pattern here in terms of these two things. I mean, we did, you may have seen, and I know I sent it to the chair, produce the reports on the encoded media incident, and we published that over the summer, if I remember rightly, late summer. Whatever went on in the latest incident, they're very different incidents. I mean, I'm happy to talk about the encoded media incident for a small moment. I mean, that I think, you know, arose from, frankly, a lack of clear line of responsibility as to who in the Bank of England was responsible for the IT infrastructure that supported the press conference and therefore the communications function. And the report laid that out, and it laid out the steps that we have taken since then to correct that. And it's again a very important matter. And you know, you can be assured that having inherited that particular situation, and Mark had certainly, you know, gone a long way in dealing with it in his time, but having inherited it, I put a lot of emphasis on that. But they are very different, I think, in terms of the nature of the issue.
Governor, I mean, it was serious enough an occurrence for us to raise in this committee.
Yes.
And thank you for updating us on lessons learned. I assume that there will be some reporting of findings in terms of your investigation, and I'm sure that the chair of this committee would want a report back to the committee in its own right on that point. But thank you very much, Chair. That's
thank you.
Questions.
Great, thank you, Mike. And that brings us to the end of this session. So could I thank our panelists very much indeed for appearing before us today. Hearing from you and having the opportunity to question you is always an extremely interesting, very rich and quite productive experience. And I think all of us would convey to you that it's been exactly like that today. So thank you very much indeed. A wide range of issues we've covered: monetary policy, a little bit of fiscal policy, QE, inflation, Brexit, business investment, jobs, and many other things. And of course, all cloaked in the modern economic epidemic of great uncertainty going forward. But I think one ray of hope that has illuminated our discussions today has been the very, very recent news that there's been yet another breakthrough on the vaccine front. So perhaps I could conclude by both thanking the members of our panel, but also those many, many thousands of men and women, scientists across the world who have worked so hard on achieving this, what appears to be a remarkable breakthrough, and brings great hope to all of us. And on that positive note, that concludes this session. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.